Alas, what love you do me wrong to cast me off discourteously? For I have loved you so long, delighting in your company. Greetings was all my joy, greetings was my delight. Greetings was my heart of gold, and who but my lady greets me?
Yes, we are back. History of England, episode 28, Red Right Hand. And again, we have green sleeves because we're talking about Henry VIII, and what better song to go of Henry VIII than green sleeves. Now, last time we looked at the early few years of the reign of Henry VIII, and I talked about how everyone was happy that Henry was king. His father was dead. And I kind of talked about what kind of person Henry VIII was at the beginning of his reign. We looked at his style of governing, we looked at his love for the church, and we looked at his love for his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And later, when she proved unable to bear a male heir, whomever he could get into his royal bed, he tended to love. And we're going to continue that story later on. We looked at his adventures in France and in the vicinity of England over Scotland, which he did not have his hand in, and we examined his relationship with his rising star, Thomas Wolsey. So, we're going to continue the story now. In the spring of 1511, a wealthy merchant named Richard Hume, or Hune, in London was faced with a tragedy. His infant son, Stephen, died. His parish priest, Thomas Dryfield, asked him for the dead child's christening robe as a gift for burying the child. It was extra traditional. Now, Hune refused to hand it over. In 1512, Hune was summoned to Lambeth Palace, where he was judged to be in contempt of court for refusing to follow custom, but he still refused to pay what he considered a large fee. That Christmas, when he entered church, he was excommunicated. Now, this is a serious matter. No one would be allowed to do business with Hune. He would not be allowed to have company. No one would be seen to excommunicate. He would also be soon be sentenced to the fires of hell when he died, if he died as excommunicate. But Hune struck back and accused the rector of slander. He challenged the legality of the church court that deemed him guilty. So the case was entered in law books, and there it sat for 22 months. In the fall of 1514, the church authorities raided the house of Hune and found a number of heretical books written in English. So he was taken to Lowther's Tower and the churchyard of St. Paul's, and that winter was found hanged. The Bishop of London declared that the heretic had felt contrition and guilt and committed suicide. But those who supported Hune, and there were some, accused the church of having murdered him. The body of Hune was taken to Smithfield, where he was burned as a convicted heretic. And meanwhile, a coroner's inquest was held to judge how he died. In February 1515, the jury decided that 3 clerics, among them William Horsey, Chancellor for the Bishop of London, had murdered Hune. The bishop wrote at once to Wolsey and called for an inquiry by man without bias. It is now that Henry VIII found himself involved in the case, and he ordered an inquiry to take place at Baynard's Castle on the north bank of the Thames by Blackfriars. There, the Bishop of London accused the members of the jury as false, prejudged wretches. He accused his own people, his own town, as wretches. At this point, Henry VIII ordered his attorney to declare the accused not guilty and to pardon them. He then left London for Exeter. This was going to be the end of the matter, he figured. But there are important consequences. See, 3 years before, the Parliament of 1512 had passed a bill requiring the benefit of clergy be removed from those in minor orders convicted of murder. See, before this time, all those clerics would have been judged in church courts and thus spared the death penalty. But now, minor orders like lectors and acolytes could be judged in criminal courts. And just for your information, lectors were those who were studying for the priesthood, or were going to be named deacons. Acolytes were those who carried the cross in the church. They lit candles, they held the Bible to be read, they helped the priest set up and tear down the altar, they swung censers, they collected the offering, really anything else that was asked. So, In the charged circumstances of the Hume affair, this new measure acquired new significance. The Abbot of Winchester had declared to the House of Lords that the Act of 1512 stood against the laws of God and the freedom of the Church. Henry Standish, who was one of the king's spiritual advisers, as well as being warden of the friars of London, did not agree. He asserted that no act of the king could be prejudicial to the church, and the church effectively came under the king's jurisdiction. So, now the questions are asked. If a secular court was able to call clergy to account, and if a temporal leader, a worldly leader, a king, could restrain a bishop ordained by God. Standish was summoned by the senior clergy of England to appear before them at a convocation and answer for his opinions. So he went to Henry for protection. And in winter of 1515, a great conference of learned men, including all the judges of the land, met at Blackfriars again, and after deliberation supported Standish, accusing the senior clergy of appealing to a foreign court, of course meaning the court in Rome. Thomas Wolsey, who had just recently been made a cardinal, offered a formal submission to Henry, asked him to submit the case to Rome. Now, this may seem to be a strange response, but I think Wolsey and the king were acting together on the matter. All now waited for Henry to respond and give judgment to the affairs of Henry Standish. So Henry addressed an assembly of lawyers and clergy of Baynard's Castle in November and agreed that Standish was right. The King of England had no superior other than God. Now, Henry was saying nothing new. This was not new. In 1351, King Edward III declared that the Holy Church of England was distinct from the Roman Catholic Church. His grandson, Richard II, had declared himself absolute emperor in England, and in 1485, Chief Justice Hussey had declared the King of England answered only to God and was above the Pope in his realm. Henry VII had often challenged the status of the church by making clear he did not want another sovereign power in his kingdom, and in appointing bishops, he had often appointed lawyers, not theologians, and none of these times did the Pope intervene. It's also odd that in his letter to Wolsey, the Bishop of London should accuse his whole flock of being heretics. It's pardonable exaggeration. The Bishop of London was simply letting the crown know that London had long proud tradition of being anti-clerical. That had always been cries from London of reforming the church, and of letting the church be ruled by the King of England, and the clergy had always been attacked, at least from the 14th century on. The parliaments in the 1370s and 1380s had wanted to remove clerics from high office, and in the Peasant Revolt of 1381, remember, the Archbishop of Canterbury was beheaded by the mob. So, the clergy was also accused of fornication and adultery. It was noted they spent their time hunting and hawking. They wore their hair long. They spent much of their time in taverns. They wore swords and daggers. But such abuse, such strident denunciations were natural and inevitable in the case of an old institution. The church was always in need of renovation and renewal. Now, when the king spoke that November day at Baynard's Castle, Wolsey had knelt before him, but he was already a mighty man. In the fall of 1515, Henry had urged Leo X, Bishop of Rome, to make Wolsey a cardinal. From now on, he was always seen dressed in scarlet. That's why I call this red right hand. He was the king's cardinal, not the pope's. He could only assist the cause of royal supremacy. At that Christmas of 1515, Wolsey was appointed Lord Chancellor, meaning he was the leading officer in England. He was the man who controlled the Great Seal. All dispatches now passed through his hands. He was in charge of the royal council. No active policy could be done without his active support. No senior post could be filled without his intervention. He commanded all domestic and international affairs of England, and he needed to do this with subtlety and dexterity. In January 1516, King Ferdinand of Spain had died, and succeeded by his grandson Charles. Now, this proved to be a delicate problem of balance and influence. Charles had been Duke of Burgundy for 10 years, and now he's Charles I, King of Spain. Now, in 1519, he would be elected Holy Roman Emperor as Charles V, and was succeeded Archduke of Austria as Charles I. Kind of confused? Yes, same guy. Charles I, Charles V, Archduke of Austria, King of Spain, Duke of Burgundy, Holy Roman Emperor, same guy, different titles. His lands in the south and center of Europe would compromise Habsburg inheritance and dominate English foreign policy for 100 years. Also, in January of 1515, Louis XII of France had died and been succeeded by his son-in-law, Francois I, and that fall had marched French troops in Italy and captured Milan. Henry had now two powerful young monarchs to contend with, and he was nowhere close to being able to play their game. In fact, until Henry died, these three kings would vie for mastery, or at least temporary supremacy. The international history of their time consisted of their moves and countermoves, their treaties and secret arrangements, their skirmishes and wars, their invasions and sieges. The emergence of three young men as kings in Europe, pretty much at the same time, altered the balance of power in Europe and led to the relative decline of the Pope. The kings were said to be all-powerful and dominated their countries and their respective churches. Charles and Francois were always going to be ready for war, if not at war with each other. Their territories are next to each other. Henry was always going to need to be ready to throw his support to one or the other, depending who was at the top at any given time. On February 18th, 1516, King Henry VIII finally had a child. It was a girl who was named Mary. But he saw her as a supreme disappointment. He'd hoped for a son and an heir. But he was happy for his wife. He hoped she would soon grant him a son. In that hope, he was mistaken. In the spring of 1517, a bill was posted upon the door of St. Paul's complaining that foreigners were given too much favor by kings and council and were bringing woes that were undoing Englishmen. And this led to the riots of the so-called Evil May Day, in which the radicalism of the London crowd became well known. See, in late April, a preacher had called upon Englishmen to defend their livings against aliens, meaning the merchants from Florence, Venice, Genoa, and Paris. Wolsey had sent for the mayor to tell him, shut these Londoners up. He feared that they revolted, the king would be upset. The king had no police force, no standing army to enforce his will. Now the mayor said, well, we're not being seditious, but on April 30th, 2,000 Londoners, with apprentices, watermen, and serving men at the head, sacked the houses of the French and Flemish merchants. They stormed the house of the king's secretary. They threatened the residents of the Italian quarter. Wolsey, cautious of trouble, despite the assurances of the mayor, called in the armed retainers and nobles and the guards in the Tower of London. More than 400 prisoners were taken, tried, found guilty of treason. 13 of these were hanged, drawn, and quartered. The remains hung on gallows throughout London as a warning. The others were taken to Westminster Hall with halters around their necks. The king, who sitting on a lofty dais, condemned all of them to death. Now at this point, Wolsey fell on his knees and begged the king to show compassion while the prisoners cried for mercy. And the king relented and he granted them all pardons. The prisoners took the halters off and danced with joy. Again, probably something that Wolsey and Henry had arranged beforehand. But this incident shows the scorn and hatred between the court and the citizens. Nobility, as well, hated and distrusted the commoners, and the commoners hated and distrusted nobility. Because the bishops and clergy took the part of nobles, that hurt their loyalty to London, which would not forgive the act. London showed that it could riot at any time, so the king and his council always had to be on guard. Then in June 1517, this is probably the worst years of Henry, really, so far. In June 1517, a fever, along with profuse and foul-smelling sweat, broke out all over England. This came with pains in the back and pains in the shoulder that moved quickly to the liver and led to lethargy and drowsiness and finally sleep and then death. It became known as a sweating sickness. It only attacked English, mostly in the cities. Thousands died. Tens of thousands died. It's still not known what the disease was. We don't know what caused it. We know it's disappeared. Now, some felt it was the houses that were causing the disease. After all, most buildings have floors covered with rushes, which would hold spit and vomit and body waste and garbage, and that's not enough. Every street had an open sewer that ran down the middle of the street into the Thames. Now, that summer, Thomas Wolsey fell ill with the sweat. Many of his household died. Wolsey was robust and determined to survive, and so he shook off the sickness through sheer will. And once fully recovered, he made a pilgrimage to Walsingham. He prayed at the shrine of Our Lady. He spent some days fasting, and he went back to work. And he did have work. In the spring of 1517, he had spoken to Henry and the council on the inefficiency and administration of justice. Now, he was not a lawyer. He had never been trained in law, but he's smart and he's self-reliant, and that got around all self-doubts he may have had about entering this realm of the English government. So he and Henry had decided to reinforce the procedure of the law. They're going to reestablish the Court of Star Chamber, held under a roof studded with stars, in which the King's Council would meet. Now, in this Court of Star Chamber, the Lord Chancellor, Wolsey, would question and punish all the great nobles who could not be touched otherwise. Lords would be punished for having too many retainers. Knights would be punished for bearing down on the poor tenants. All cases of perjury, all cases of forgery would be investigated here. And Wolsey also regulated prices and food supplies because he understood that scarcity produced riots. And he used his court to suppress and punish all public disorder. All sheriffs were investigated. Under Henry VII, who established his court, there's maybe 12 cases a year. Under Wolsey, about 120 cases. And Wolsey also had the Court of Chancery, which he controlled. Now, this is a civil, not a criminal court. So here matters of inheritance and contract were resolved. The plaintiffs would be allowed to come state the case verbally. The court would summon defendants through a writ. In this way, Wolsey could hear appeals against judgments in common law, and he could keep a tight grip upon all business in England. Every day he went in procession to Westminster Hall, with 2 great crosses of silver carried before him, and then the great seal, and then his cardinal's hat. He would dress in crimson silk, and he would carry a hollowed-out orange filled with vinegar, right here. That way he did not have to smell the common people he walked through. Now, Wolsey was hated by everyone he would punish, but by August 1517, England was finally at peace with itself. And because of this, Wolsey was given even more power. He was allowed to establish an inquiry into why many counties in England were dropping in population. Now, this has been happening for generations, of course, but it had been slow and had not been seen until it was too late to stop it. By the time the government realized that the enclosure of land by richer, more efficient farmers was a gross injustice, it was a fact that cannot be reversed. A society of smallholders have been replaced by groups of large tenant farmers who had landless laborers working for them. Now, there are many tracts and many pamphlets written against enclosure, and enclosed lands are used to rear sheep and not produce crops. I have read some of these. One shepherd could now do a job that had once taken 20 farmers in that same part of land. Whole towns and villages were empty, ruins, decaying. The old house of the rural tenants, they've been taken back by the wind and the rain. The village church was being used for cattle. It was hard then, and it still is hard today to blame enclosure on all of this, though. Closure was part of it, yes, but it was also a series of bad harvests and steadily growing population that caused less work being needed in this country, and enclosure had been a fact of life since the Black Death, when fields lay idle and were able to be snatched up cheap by those who survived. You cannot stop the process now. That's been 200 years in the making. It would be a crisis that England would be dealing with for generations. But England was still an agricultural society, made of freeholders and leaseholders, tenants and laborers, all owing lines to a lord. They lived in a common village, centrally located with farmlands all around. They lived in a society that was hurt if bad weather came and hurt the harvest. But the old ties and manor system now gave way to new laws of the market. Custom replaced by law and contract. Communal efforts slowly being supplanted by competition. Large farmers would be able to sell their produce to the cities. Small farmers, well, they hoped to make enough to survive one more year, eating what they grew. Land was an investment. The rent for a tenant was now what the market rent was. It was a slow, long process, not really coming to an end until about the time of King George III. And then there was something else at that point, the Industrial Revolution, which we will be talking about anon, many anons from now. A lot of stuff to say. Okay. Switching topics again. In 1518, some Cambridge scholars started to meet at the White Horse Tavern in Cambridge to debate intellectual issues of the day. Now, the main issue of the day was religion and should it be reformed. Now, some of these scholars were attracted to the ideas of Luther in Germany, happening just at that moment. Others wanted to strip the church of all pomp and ceremony. Others, even more radical, wanted to return to what the church was like when Jesus and the early disciples walked the earth. Now, one of the books they were reading was a book by a man named Erasmus, who, when he had been professor of divinity at Queen's College in Cambridge, had written a Greek and Latin translation of the New Testament, which was to replace the old Vulgate of the church, which is more than 1,000 years old at that time. See, Erasmus believed that the rituals and formal theology of the church was less important than the spiritual reception and the message of Scripture, along with inward faith in God's grace and in the redemptive power of Jesus. Erasmus used satire, and he attacked the excessive devotion to relics and the frequent result to pilgrimages and the degeneration in monastic orders. He did not think that the sacraments were all that important to a Christian life. Now, he never advanced into radical doctrine, but he was an early reformer, as much as Wycliffe. In fact, about Erasmus, Luther and Tyndale had never been able to translate the Greek New Testament. Now, Erasmus did entertain the idea that scriptures would be freely available to everyone, which the church did not like, but they could not ignore that part. He did not really push it too much. So, as I mentioned, in the fall of 1517, Martin Luther came to the scene. He spoke out against the church. He led a much more fiery dogmatic charge to reform than Erasmus ever thought about. He was close to the ideas of Erasmus, but he moved beyond them. His ideas of justification by faith alone as a free gift from God to the individual without the intercession of priest and ritual. He stated that the church must not come between God and the individual, and that once a person believed in sacrifice of Christ, he was granted eternal life, and if he did not believe, eternal fire. Bam. I just took about 40,000 books of Luther and just made it into one paragraph. Anyway, in a series of pamphlets, Luther attacked the beliefs the beliefs of the Roman Catholic Church. He stated the Pope in Rome was Antichrist, that only 2 sacraments are needed: baptism, Holy Communion. Every good Christian was a priest, he said, and grace and faith were enough for salvation, and finally that Scripture was enough to save. Now, Luther had been discussed in the White Horse Tavern since he had come onto the public scene on October 31st, 1517. In fact, the White Horse Tavern was named Germany by those who went to it, and those who discussed the new ideas, Germans. Now, this group would eventually end up either as archbishops or bishops of the English Church, or being burned at the stake for their beliefs. Some got both. They included Thomas Cranmer, who would become Archbishop of Canterbury, William Tyndale, who would write an English Bible, Nicholas Ridley, Matthew Parker. The reading of Luther deepened their faith, and they soon went out and preached to those they met. Now, meanwhile, in the spring of 1518, Wolsey had been appointed by the urgent words of Henry VIII as papal legate for England, meaning he was a representative of Rome at the English court, where he was already chief minister. He represented everything the reformers hated. He was a whore in scarlet, they said. See, whenever he made a submission as the Pope's envoy, he'd come in, laid before the crown, the king, and then he'd leave the court and reappear as a chief minister to answer the submission. The church and the royal council were guided by the same person. Henry, however, paid attention to this, and later on he realized that he could be the one who controlled the church without interference of external power. Now, as papal legate, Wolsey could now reform the English church. And so in the spring of 1519, he sent so-called visitors to the monasteries who record the conditions and habits of the monks, which of course they found to be generally off. This abbot brought dogs to the church. This monk drank in a local tavern. This prior was involved in adultery of the miller's wife, and so on, going on for centuries. The church had always ignored it, but now Wolsey punished principal offenders and he sent out strict regulations to guide for future conduct. Of course, Wolsey himself was extremely rich in collecting church offices. He was Bishop of Bath and Wells. He was Bishop of Durham. He was Bishop of Winchester. He was Archbishop of York, Abbot of St. Albans, Chief Minister, Lord Chancellor, War Minister, and Papal Legate and Cardinal. His tables groaned with gold and silver plates. His palaces had hung on their walls fine tapestries. He was the richest man in England, richer than Henry VIII. But he always argued that he was simply maintaining the power of the church with all he had. In the spring of 1520, Rome declared the doctrines of Luther as heretical, ordered them burnt. So in the spring of 1521, Wolsey obeyed, burning all the works of Luther in the pyre in St. Paul's churchyard. But the new doctrine was already known by many scholars who were still talking about it and preaching about it, and you cannot stop it once it got started. The so-called known man, as the court called them, were talking about doctrines of Luther in every tavern in England. You cannot stop it. The books of Luther were being smuggled into England through the ports from the Low Countries and the cities of Rhineland. Even Henry VIII read a copy of On the Babylonian Captivity of the Church. By the way, a very interesting book, you should read it. And he read it. And then he wrote to Leo X, Bishop of Rome, that he was determined to suppress the heresies in texts. Wolsey and Thomas More, a new friend of court, helped Henry write a pamphlet entitled In Defense of the Seven Sacraments. I say helped, they probably wrote it. But anyway, Henry is the author, as much as John F. Kennedy's Arthur Profile encouraged. But anyway, for this act, although it wasn't brilliant writing, Henry was awarded by Leo X the title of Defender of the Faith. Supposedly this title could not be inherited. But every single king and queen of England has used it since. Luther wrote a reply to the pamphlet. He attacked Henry as a king of liars and a damned rotten worm. Henry would never warm toward Lutheranism as a result. He remained really Orthodox Catholic until the day he died. Meanwhile, 2 months after Henry had written this, Leo X died, and there are some who believed that Wolsey should be the next Bishop of Rome. But the conclave of cardinals would never elect Englishmen, and besides, Wolsey was really too busy to leave England and press his candidacy. He was still sending visitors to all the monasteries, and he was writing new constitutions for the secular clergy. He was guiding monastic elections to get his man elected abbot, and he was firing abbots he did not favor. He was a really busy man. In the spring of 1523, he dissolved a convocation of senior clergy that met at Cambridge and summoned them to Westminster, and there he imposed a new system of taxation on the wealth. From now on, archbishops and bishops had to pay Wolsey a tribute before they took their posts. Any proposed reforms in church courts, and he asserted that all matters involving wills and inheritance were to be personally handled by him. The church was back to the days of Henry II, and in his office, Wolsey was even issuing papal bulls sanctioned by the Vatican that were causing the English clergy to hate him even more. So basically, Wolsey was hated by everyone, And as papal legate, he had other duties. Now, one of his duties, he was supposed to bring peace between Christian princes of Europe. In this way, once peace had been formed between all the Christians in Europe, a grand crusade against the Turks would be undertaken. Now, as a diplomat, no one could touch Wolsey. And in 1518, he was always meeting with ambassadors from the Holy Roman Empire and France and Spain. And in that fall, the Treaty of London was signed between all these men, and Wolsey took credit. Wolsey was the height of his power. In 14 years as Lord Chancellor, he had only bothered to call Parliament once. But though he acted as if he was King of England, he knew his power was given to him by Henry, and once given, could be taken away if he displeased Henry. So the Treaty of London was declared to be the will of Henry, and he was given honor, not Wolsey. Now Henry was happy then, but not so happy when Charles I of Spain became Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, again controlling Austria, Poland, Switzerland, Germany, Low Countries, Spain, and her colonies. So in the fall of 1519, I'm sorry I keep jumping around, but this is all taking place from 1515, 1523. Anyway, 1519. the three young kings of Europe began to engage in elaborate ceremonies of peace, while all preparing for war. In the summer of 1520, Henry sailed for France with 4,000 men to meet Francois I at the so-called Field of the Cloth of Gold, a grand tournament held near Calais, under pavilions and palaces, towers and gateways made up of tents, with artificial lakes and bridges and statues and fountains that gushed beer and wine. It lasted 17 days, with tournaments and dances. In the end, Henry lost a wrestling match with Francois, and so nothing important was decided. And meanwhile, Henry and Charles had been secretly meeting in England, and after 3 days of feasting and dancing, along with hours of negotiation in Cambridge and then in Calais, it was decided that Spain and England would declare war against France, and that Henry would be awarded the French throne, finally. So did this happen or not? Or did maybe other matters take the mind of Henry at this time? Stay tuned and find out next time.
Your vows you've broken like my heart. Oh, why did you so enrapture me? Now I remain in a world apart, but my heart remains in captivity. Please, please, was all my joy. Please, please, was my delight. Please, please, was my heart of gold. And who but my lady, please, please.